Welcome to the State of Us podcast with Ian O'Doherty, proudly brought to you by Rivada Space Networks. They're pioneers in secure, next-generation global communications, and with their revolutionary outer net technology, Rivada is redefining connectivity. They're delivering ultra-secure, high-speed data transmission for governments, for businesses, and for you. Rise above the clutter of the public internet with Rivada Networks, and learn more at rivadaspace.com. Now, let's get on with today's conversation. Well, welcome to the latest edition of the State of Us. And I have to say, I'm personally delighted and honoured to welcome the great Stella O'Malley.
Oh, that's very nice. Thank you.
Psychotherapist, author, journalist, lover of 90s indie music, which we'll be getting into because that's probably the most important bit of all of our lives anyway, let's be honest. And I don't like your attitude about dogs.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll be discussing that. But come here, tell me about how things are going for you at the moment and how strange things have been for you over the last few years.
Yeah, I'm living quite a strange life these days. I was, up until about 2017, I had a very normal life. I was a psychotherapist and I wrote books about mental health and, you know, very unusual. And then I somehow landed into the trans issue, and it's been the strangest, weirdest, and I continuously tried to get back out, if you follow me, for some years, but I couldn't get back out. It's a long story, but effectively the very, very sad stories that I got by email every day and the quantity of them meant that I couldn't turn away. It was too sad.
This is the thing. It seems that everybody I know, and like, I don't want this to become a trans show.
Yeah.
Right. You know, but it's the kind of hot topic.
Oh, yeah.
You know, of the moment, of the zeitgeist. But everybody I know who's involved in it doesn't want to be involved in it. No. They just want to walk away. And they find that they can't, because it's a bit like The Godfather. Every time they try and get out, they're dragged back in again. You know,
there's a horse's head on your pillow. Yeah, I think you're right. I think I remember when I was younger, and I had a friend called John, and when he was younger and he was in college, he went traveling, and he was traveling in Africa, and he effectively. You remember back then, college students went traveling, the gap years and stuff like that. And he effectively wandered into Ethiopia and wandered into the famine as such. And I was like, well, what did you do? This is in the pub many years later. And he was like, well, there was nothing I could do except just hang around and help. You couldn't leave, if you follow me. You just couldn't. Yeah. He said it was just immediately just you started helping, you started doing the soup, started doing everything. And he said, I deferred college for a year. Like, there was no way you could just move on. It feels very similar for that for me.
So a sort of a moral compulsion.
You couldn't face so much devastation that I have in particular, because I'm a psychotherapist. I think that if you get every single day, even there, I just got a big long email, and we're talking a whole kind of like, my family has been ripped up by this. And I didn't see it coming, and I'm an engaged, decent person, and I'll never be the better for it. That you realise sometimes you just have to do the right thing, and I didn't want to stay in it.
How hard is it for you as a therapist to separate the work from your life? Do you take this stuff home with you? You know, this is something I've always been curious about. It's like, do doctors take the work home? Because if you see something that's right, I remember when my father was dying, and the consultant said, basically, look, you're looking at 6 weeks, effectively. And we were all in bits, we were all in tears. And I went outside the hospital car park to have a cigarette and sort of gather my senses. And I saw the doctor get into his car and he was laughing with somebody else. It was like something that, and you kind of go, okay, fair enough. I mean, but how do you find it in the sense that, does it weigh on you? Or do you just shrug it off when you close the front door?
So I've been working for decades as a psychotherapist and have seen really awful stories, and I continue to see people with some really awful. I can think of one or two now that I'm kind of thinking about it. But mostly you can shrug it off. Mostly you think that's work and you move on. But with let's say specifically about with trans, why that kept me in, it was the quantity. It was a new one, a new one, a new one, a new one. Do you follow me? It wasn't just one story. Imagine if every one of the stories are kind of the same, if you follow me, and they're incredibly similar scenarios. And you're like, well, I'm not in the middle of a very sad story. I'm in the middle of a cultural phenomenon. Do you know what I mean? There's a very big difference then, because if it was just really sad stories, sure, I've been dealing with them forever. It was like there was a complete theme happening, and that made it very different. I remember, I was from 2017 to 2020, I was trying to pull away. I released a book on anxiety, determined to get the hell away from trans. So that came out in 2019. And I was writing a book on teenage, being a teenager and parenting teenagers. And then COVID happened and suddenly I had time, because I would have done an awful lot of work in person until COVID. And COVID happened and I thought, oh, I should really do those parent meetings that I've always been asked since the film came out. I did a film in 2018 for Channel 4. So that film came out in 2018 and for Tell
me a bit about the film, Asha.
Yeah.
It was great.
I'll tell you about that in a sec. I'll just finish this story.
Right.
So we did the film in 2018, and for 2 years I was inundated with emails. You know what I mean? Please help me, please help me, please help me. And finally in 2020, I says, okay, I'll help the parents. I'll do online meetings. And I did that first online meeting in March 2020. And I remember I went down to my husband, Henry, into this, fire in the sitting room going, and I was shook. I was really shook after. There was about 20 parents and they told me stories, and when you're just plastered to the wall, like this is beyond belief what these people are going through. And that was a defining moment for me of realizing something awful is happening and nobody knows about it. And by the way, just so you know, those meetings, it started with one meeting. Within a month there was 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 meetings a week. And now we like the organization I run, we have a meeting every single day of the year. Online meetings. I don't.
So tell me about Janspect.
Yeah, well, I tell you about the film first.
Okay, tell me about the film first.
I'll tell you how I got into it all. I kind of when I was a kid, I had kind of what would be considered gender dysphoria. I wanted to be a boy, and I wanted to be a boy for very many years, and it wasn't nice, and I didn't like it, and it was fine as a kid, because when you're a kid, you're like, you're Superwoman and Superman, and you don't care, and. I'm a boy and I went into the boys' changing rooms and I wore the boys' funny, like that back then. This was, the 80s, and we had a school.
So you were a tomboy?
A total tomboy, yeah. But looking back, I was that bit weirder than most tomboys. Do you remember when you were a kid? There was a few tomboys and then there was the kind of wacko child. I was the wacko child. Yeah. I was definitely very strange with it. And so we had a school uniform, for example, and the girls wore kilts and the boys wore grey trousers. And I wore trousers. So that was unusual back then. They didn't do that in schools in the 80s. Like girls just wore skirts and nobody kind of did that but they didn't build a policy around it. So I was let be a weird child. And I moved on beyond it. I had, a very difficult puberty. And I think I would have easily been diagnosed with something wrong with me. And I was an unhappy family. So it doesn't really surprise me that, something kicked off with me. And then I moved on and I didn't think about it. And I certainly wasn't very interested in anything to do with trans or anything like it for many years. And if anybody brought up trans, I'd think, oh, they got stuck. Like I was like that and they got stuck. They got stuck in the mind. Yeah. So I had a very good understanding of it. Whenever I met somebody trans, I'd think, oh, yeah. It would be like if you had OCD as a kid and then you met another OCD person when you were an adult and you go, oh, right. I remember what that was like. And, sympathy, but yeah. I remember that. And didn't touch anything to do with trans. Became a psychotherapist in my 30s. Nothing to do with any of that. Very interested in addiction, actually. And then wrote books about parenting and stuff like that. And then I was releasing a book about bullying in 2017. And I'd been noticing the weirdness of the trans discourse in the media. And I thought, I must write an article for the Sunday Indo. I was writing for the Sunday. Just whenever I wanted, I'd write an article, throw an article into them, just kind of, this is interesting, or mental health. And it was always mental health. And I wrote one about trans issues in 2017. And they printed it because Ireland, at this stage, didn't even know what trans was. Although they knew enough to know that was the first article I ever had any legal. They put they put the lawyers all over that article. And there was pushback. It's the same mother who gives pushback. She'll give pushback to this podcast. She gives pushback everywhere because she trans her kid at about 3 or 4.
Oh, I know the person you're talking about, but we won't mention the name.
Yeah, and so there was pushback, and it was ridiculous because they were very misinformed. So they said, there's studies out that 3 months after transition, these children are happy. And I'm like, I couldn't care less whether they're happy after 3 months. What are they like after 3 years, and what are they like after 10 years? You know what I mean? 3 months is nothing. And so as a result of that, I got asked to do the film, which is called Trans Kids, It's Time to Talk. And the premise of the film would be, could any of the 4,000% rise in girls seeking medical transition, could any of them be like me, a kid who had dark, difficult gender issues and moved beyond them and became completely happy with being a woman and actually a mother, and very pleased that she is one. Do you know what I mean? That was the premise. And for that, we were eviscerated. For that, it was like trans activists just haunted us, and I got my own stalker, and it was an
Well, tell me about the stalker.
Well, just an online stalker, you know what I mean? That just kind of never stopped, just constantly writing about me. And then you go to lawyers and you spend a lot of money and time, compiling this is what they've said and stuff like that. And the lawyer's like going, well, that person has no money. You know what I mean? They're on the dole. There's very little you can do to stop them, really. You know what I mean? So it was a kind of a horrible experience of realizing that you have no control over the way everybody's talking about you. And it was a lovely film. It was a good film. It was a nice film.
It was.
Yeah,
But the funny thing is that I remember it got really good reviews in print media, sort of legacy media or grown-up newspapers or whatever way you want to call it. And I got hammered on social media.
Yeah, that's true.
And it was like two completely different optics. The normal people who saw it thought, this is really thoughtful. It was very gentle.
Yeah, it was very gentle.
And then other people just went...
A key part of it is we got shot by both sides when that film came out. You know what I mean? The rad femmes hated it because it was gentle. The trans activists hated it because it was speaking about trans and I wasn't trans or something like that. I don't know. They are, not very rational. And so we made an enemy of everybody, if you follow me, which was really difficult. It was funny, the director, Ollie Lambert, he had he's spent his whole career, 30 years, working in war zones. And after our film, he went on and did a film, 24 Hours in Gaza. And
all right, yeah.
And he said he had to leave the toxic culture of the trans wars. So he went to Gaza.
Got to Gaza for a break.
But he said there was nothing and then after Gaza, he went to Ukraine. He did a brilliant film about Ukraine, by the way. And he said there was nothing like the toxicity of just the extraordinary online weirdness that I'm still not over. I only joined Twitter at that stage, so I was very much a new virgin at this whole world. I was living out in the countryside in Ireland. I wasn't having anything like that life. And I saw the darkest of humanity in these last few years. I've really aged and I've really changed. And I didn't have an easy life. But what I saw in the last few years have been just the lack of integrity and the lack of honesty and the weasel, cowardly nature of so many people. And I had no idea. I thought I was just dealing with people, decent people. There was a presumption of decency that I was giving to the world that I don't give anymore.
Well, this is probably career suicide by me, but on this issue and on several others, I think the Irish media have failed in their responsibility to accurately cover an issue that's probably disproportionately important. I mean, like this shouldn't be a big deal.
Yeah.
Yet it is actually the thing that everybody's talking about. But you used to be everywhere. You were RT's darling.
Well,
And what happened?
Well, you know, quite a lot of things happened. For starters, you know, there's a kind of a playbook people have around when talking about trans issues. First of all, they say, "Oh, listen, this is niche and it's funny. Get a grip." You know what I mean? Forget about it. Then they undermine it and say, "There's no story here. It's tiny numbers." And then they say, "You're a bigot." If you follow me, you know, it goes bang, bang, bang. You're like, well, what happened to it? This is niche and it's funny. That was only 2 days ago. And so arguably, Ireland were very late to figuring out the landscape of trans. They didn't understand it. The intelligentsia, well, I would use that word
Loosely.
Yeah, maybe we shouldn't call them that. Certainly the media and the establishment, the regime media, you could call them, they didn't seem to really be up on it. They knew it was war over in America and England, but they weren't really up on it. And so when I did that article in 2017, and I did quite a few articles, 2018, 2019, and you're right, I was all over your RTE, and I was all over different media, and everybody knew I had a bit of a kind of, oh, she's a little bit wacko there over in the trans thing, but we'll ignore that and we'll do everything else. And I was perfectly fine. I just want to talk about mental health, and I had no aching need to talk about trans every day of the week. But I did notice the lack of honesty, because it was like, actually, Ireland had done very well medically. We'd done very bad legally as regards trans issues, but we'd done very well medically. So legally, we allowed in self-ID in 2015. So that was a disaster. And we brought in other policies that were pretty awful legally, just very, very bad, vague, inappropriate language that was used. So that was one bad thing about Ireland. But medically, out in Loughlinstown, you know, Professor Donald O'Shea and Dr. Paul Moore, and they'd been running the National Gender Service since the 90s. And they'd kept a very tight grip on it. They were the only English-speaking national gender service in the world that rejected WPATH. Now, I can't tell you how big a deal that is. Every single other national service just yielded to these trans activist lunatics who told them how to kind of medicalise really young children, and it was really awful.
And of course, WPATH has now been completely discredited.
Oh, completely discredited. They're an absolute, what would you call them, a ramshackle wreck. They're an activist organisation, and they're not credible. Like you say, they're discredited. And Donald and Paul out in Loughlinstown, they kept a firm. They said WPATH isn't safe and isn't sound. They said that years before anybody else was saying it. And so we had a good situation in Ireland. We had the National Gender Service who were sensible. We had media who weren't really clued in, but they hadn't really been captured, with bad legal issues, but nobody was. For example, England didn't have self-ID, but trans women, as would be males who were, you know, identifying as trans. They, you know, Karen White was a trans woman and raped, sexually assaulted women in prison cells in 2017. Now, none of that was happening in Ireland. We had self-ID, but the trans women that were put into the female prisons, they were put upstairs and they were separated from the women. It was a very Irish solution to an Irish problem. Yeah, sure, you're a trans woman. Now you'll go up there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's very English and that's very Irish, for want of a sweeping general, you know, for being accused of a sweeping generalisation, that the English would say, well, you're a trans woman, so in you go to the cell. You know what I mean? While Ireland was like much subtler about it and separated them. But yeah, they had it in their hands. Ireland could have been a leading model of how to keep sanity in a country. We weren't touched by it. The Tavistock, who are now discredited and closed down, they came over to Ireland and they administered puberty blockers to Irish children from 2013 to around about 2022, 2023. So for about 10 years, we had an English clinic coming over because nobody in Ireland would touch it. Ireland was staying sane. And the worst we had was the English clinic coming over. And so we really had all the kind of infrastructure ready to be decent. And then in the last few years, we got basically RTE, as far as I've kind of tracked it a little bit, and they got a fright in 2022 because of a couple of incidents, and they folded like paper. They had no spine, and they chose not to be the journalists or the reporters that they had chosen as a career. They had chosen instead to be the equivalent of teachers or, you know what I mean, shopkeepers who just did what they were told, and the opposite of a journalist who's supposed to go and check the story out. You know that phrase, you know, if one crowd says it's raining, the other crowd says it's wet or dry, you open the window and find out what the weather's like. You know, they did not do that. They didn't do it in the public service broadcast in RTE. That's where they kind of...
I always thought, from the time I was a kid when I was starting out, I always thought both the responsibility, the primary responsibility, and the ultimate pleasure of being a journalist was causing trouble and annoying the establishment.
Yeah.
And that attitude seems to have changed. You know, and like, I mean, I looked at you, and I mean, I've been observing you for the last few years, and you could see this, what I'd almost call a sort of a slow cancellation.
Yeah.
You know, where we don't do it quickly, we just do it very subtly, and that's more insidious.
Yeah. It's very Irish, I would say. What in England and other countries, I've become friendly with so many people overseas these days, and when you're cancelled, you know about it. In Ireland, it's much more quieter, and effectively, all the gigs dried up, all the requests for articles, all the requests for interviews. In fairness, News Talk continue to ask me to do interviews, but all the requests stopped coming in. And it wasn't immediate, you know what I mean? So in 2018, when the film came out, it didn't stop then, because trans was irrelevant in Ireland in 2018. Nobody knew anything about it. 2019, 2020, it was fine. And then around about 21, 22 is when they got antsy and they backed off very quiet. It's like they tiptoed out of the building. They tiptoed away from me, you know. And honestly, I can live with it. Luckily enough, I've been very successful in my career, and I've kind of got a lot of respect in places that I want the respect. And so I don't feel the need for respect from RTE, but I certainly don't have respect for RTE. I think they've really let themselves down. I think they've let themselves down as public service broadcasters. And I think they know it. There's this feeling that they're out there hiding. I think Ryan Tubridy and all that seem to just brutalise them. They seem to have just gone into this kind of cramped paralysis where they just say very little and they do very little. But I think, you know, in particular, like, I think 2022 was the year that the RTE, that the Irish media just seized up around trans and didn't do anything. And they read the room wrong. They called it wrong, because when you look at Trump, for example, and you can see that, like, you know, he won his election on, you know, the slogan, what is it? We're for...
Kamala's for they, them. Donald Trump is for you.
Yeah.
Brilliant slogan.
Very good.
It's like Make America Great Again, or It's the Economy Stupid. You just give it something that's very simple, easy to remember, and is true, and it works. Yeah. And this is the thing I find, excuse me, what I find quite remarkable is how many journalists that I know and that I like. I wouldn't necessarily go as far to say that I respect, but I know and I like them. And they're either deliberately ignoring this because they don't want the hassle, or they're actually writing things that they don't believe. But I think I was saying this to you earlier, is that, I mean, the moment I felt my kind of imminent divorce because I always said that being a journalist wasn't what I did, it was who I was, right? From the time I was a kid, right? All I wanted to be was a journalist. It was so romantic about it. Oh. You know, I couldn't sleep the night before a piece would appear, right? But I remember after the Charlie Hebdo massacre, having a meltdown in the newsroom and saying, we need to run the cartoons. We need to run the cartoons. They've just killed 13 of us, and we need to run the cartoons. They didn't run the cartoons. And yet they all then posed for one of those stupid pictures where they're all holding a little thing saying, Je suis Charlie.
Oh, yeah.
And I refused. I just walked out, and it was like, you are not Charlie.
Yeah, je ne suis pas Charlie.
Yeah, I mean,
no.
we could have ran those cartoons.
That would have been Je suis Charlie.
That would have been Je suis Charlie.
Yeah.
Instead. But look, I mean, I went from being an angry young man to being a grumpy outfit, so I mean, it was a fairly seamless transition. It wasn't really that much of a big deal. But so, were you bitter about the way people turned their back on you?
Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say I'm bitterly disappointed, but I often use the word embittered. Like, they made me bitter, if you follow me. I'll take it on, but they embittered me. Their behavior was beneath them. It wasn't appropriate. And this idea that they could this kind of derisive little laugh, and it's not really an issue. And it's like, well, it actually is an issue. When children are being medicalized and experimented upon, it's an issue. That's an issue. I'm sorry. When families' lives are being ripped apart, and they are, it's an issue. Like the organization, a year after I started those parent online meetings, that was in 2020, I started Genspect. So that was kind of a year later, 2021. And we've, over 1,000 families being helped, and we've over 360 detransitioners being helped. So, like, when an Irish organisation is helping that level of people who've detransitioned, 360 detransitioners is a lot of people who are being helped. And the Irish media haven't any interest in that. Like, really? Really? Because they're busy kind of pulling out some random trans person and saying that they're the most oppressed people in the world. It's like, no, detrans people have a much harder life of it. These are kids that, you know what I mean, they medicalized at a young age, and maybe they had a mastectomy at 18, and they've got a male voice. They'll have hair, they'll have, hair.
And they get hammered by the trans community.
Yeah, and they have, hair in their chest, mastectomy, hair in their bum, low voice, and then they realize at 25, I shouldn't have done that. I was just a butch lesbian, and I got lured into an idea, and I was autistic, and I should have been just left alone. Their lives are really, really, when they have phalloplasty or vaginoplasty, it's really awful. Their lives, really, really, really difficult. And for people to pretend there's no story here is dishonest. And that's what an awful lot of media have done. They've pretended, and it's like I say, if they were teachers, I'd forgive them. If they were shopkeepers, I'd forgive them. But journalists' job is to uncover the truth. This is a huge story.
And is that laziness or moral cowardice or just a desire to stay within the in-group?
Well, you asked me earlier, am I bitter? What I think I've been massively disappointed by the lack of integrity people have. Like, I remember I was interviewed by Jennifer Connell in 2019, and this is when, like, Primetime think they've covered trans because they've done it twice in the last 6 years. They did it, I think, once in 2019 and once in maybe 2024. They've covered trans, and may I say, you would need a lot more than that. But she interviewed me in 2019, and it was a very good interview. I was appearing on Primetime for that segment. It was about 10 minutes in 2019. And I gave her a full hour of my time discussing all the issues, all the kind of ifs and buts, and you know what I mean? And I'm very knowledgeable about psychology and, you know what I mean, where these things are coming from. And then she wrote this article that I just thought, like, was she even speaking to me? Like, because it was, for example, recommending binders for teenagers. Now, a binder, imagine if there was an article released today that was recommending foot binding for teenagers. You'd go, what? What? Sorry? Like, a binder and anybody who wants to know what a binder is, go and buy one online, put it on your chest, and come back to me and tell me whether binders are appropriate. It's effectively self-harm for teenagers. It's a really, really hard kind of metal-like garment that you put on your chest, and it deforms the girls' breasts. And so no wonder they lead to mastectomies, because it constricts their breathing. They can't do PE. Loads of teenagers in Ireland are using these binders, and the Irish Times was recommending binders after speaking to me for an hour. It was surreal that was her take on it. I do think an awful lot of journalists were quite uninformed, But at the same time, when they were informed by myself and other people, they chose to look away. And I've thought about this very deeply. Like, why? Why are they looking away? And I think fear of being unpopular is the biggest. Everybody says, oh, it's their jobs. And I've looked at it and I've watched, let's say Joe Duffy, there was 2 days on Joe Duffy in 2022 where some women spoke very eloquently and very well about women's rights with regards to trans issues. And it was clear, Joe understands it. And Joe is uncancelable. Joe could have been the J.K. Rowling of Ireland. You know what I mean? Like, nobody's going to call Joe Duffy a far-right bigot. And yet, he shied away from it. 2 days, and that was it. He's done trans. So Primetime did it in 2 events in 6 years. Joe Duffy does it in 2 days. The Irish Times have just gone completely ideological and recommend binders to teenagers, which, like, all I can say is, have they lost their minds? And I would say it's a lack of moral courage. And there is a lot I know because they follow me and they send me DMs saying, I really agree, I really respect your work. These are just kind of random, generally male journalists who clearly know the issues and they lack the strength of character to actually confront it. And the odd time somebody pops their head out, like Mick Clifford, I was defamed in the Dáil by Mick Barry.
Oh yeah.
Jesus. And it was a terrible moment because I'd given a talk for I wasn't quite cancelled. It was 2022. The slow tipping away was starting to happen. 2022 was a key year for trans in the media in Ireland. And I'd given a great talk. I'd heard it was really good. And when you know you're good. And it was one of those good talks. It was about gender issues in schools and it was for principals and deputy principals for the ETBI. So it was a big conference and I'd given a good talk. And I'd heard later that the guy who was the kind of the trans guy of the ETBI had said it was a great talk, it was really good. Later on in the bar that night, yeah, Stella was great. Then the next morning he clearly got a phone call. Stella was not good. You need to get with the program. And the word politically correct comes from Russia. Yeah. And it's like, it might be correct, but is it politically correct? So that's what happened there with that guy. And so then he put in a complaint. And from that, in the weird world of trans, suddenly this I don't know what it's called, this clown, frankly, from Cork, Mick Barry, the TD, was in the Dáil saying that I was a controversial therapist who shouldn't have been speaking about trans issues to the principals of Ireland. And I was like, who is this clown? And why is he commenting on something he knows nothing about? He's some sort of kind of working class hero. And an awful lot of these working class heroes have kind of swapped class politics for identity politics without realizing that they've actually sold out their class. By doing that, like you couldn't get it more.
That's a fascinating point, Stella, because this is the thing: is that I'm from Crumlin. I'll always be working class. I might live in a nicer area, but I'm working class. I always will be, and I'm proud of it. And say if I was to have kids, which I don't, they'd probably grow up to be middle class. But you can't change where you're from, right? But what I saw, and I'm traditionally from the left, and like my father was a communist. My first holiday was to Romania under the Ceausescu regime that the Romanians paid for my father as part of a fraternal workers exchange.
Yikes.
Right? And in fairness to him,
your father was friends with Ceausescu.
Well,
there's the name of a book.
But the first thing he did when he got home was that he went into the CPI's office and he ceremonially burned his party card. Oh. And he said, "This doesn't work." Oh. Right? And he then just became a lifelong Labour activist. But so I've always been of Labour anyway. I mean, I had a brief flirtation with the Connolly youth when I was a kid because kids are stupid, and that's what you do. But the left have abandoned the working class.
Yeah.
The left has become a middle class obsession.
Totally.
And I look around and people are now talking about ordinary working class people being far right. It's like they're not far right. These are traditionally people who would have been Labour voters. But because Labour became infested with the graduate class, so we've swapped the working class for the graduate class. And the graduate class hates the working class. So now the working class has absolutely nobody to speak for them. The party that was set up to represent them now hates them.
Yeah.
Like, it's heartbreaking.
And, you know, it is heartbreaking because actually poor working class people, like people who are poor, need a voice. They need a hand. It's not as if they've gone away, if you follow me.
Yeah.
And I do think that there's an awful lot of really sad lives out there that are not getting a voice for them, while the likes of Richard Boyd Barrett and Paul Murphy, they're talking rubbish, and they are very privileged people. They're
the BlackRock Bolsheviks, as I call them. You know?
Yeah, but to go back to the, you know, the kind of regime journalists who backed out, you know, when Mick Barry, he defamed me in the Dáil, and I should have taken a case, and I'm kind of more litigious now as a result, because I regret not taking that case against him.
Well, he's all privileged.
I know, but he tweeted about it after.
Oh, big mistake.
Because he's a clown. But I was a bigger clown not taking him. I should have had my day. But anyway, you live and learn. But that was 2022. That was that weird time. Within about 2 weeks, those women were on live line talking on Joe Duffy, if you follow me. So that was all the same few weeks. And then Dublin Pride censored RTE in June 22. So the whole of the kind of in-the-know journalists basically got the memo. Stay the hell away from trans and stay the hell away from the likes of me. And that was it. My kind of gigs dried up that year. There's no doubt about it. And I had gone through the difficult years. They had tested me on the trans issue, and I'd come out well, because I am very well. I'm very compassionate, and I'm very kind of thoughtful in my approach around. I'm certainly not zealot, put it that way. And so they reversed. They ran scared. And I truly believe they ran scared because they were afraid of a lack of popularity. And also they haven't done their homework. It's a complex issue. And when you haven't done your homework, you stay away from it. And they don't understand it. And I actually think there's a visceral disgust reaction from a lot of men. And they just think, I just stopped talking about this. I can't deal with it. And they have this kind of, and they're just like, I don't want to know. I don't want to know. And I don't think people confront that, but there's an awful lot of men in particular, I think, who have castration anxiety. I do think that's one of the reasons.
Well, in fairness, Stella, I don't know any bloke who isn't terrified of something like that.
But there's something as well. Men are so like, just stop talking about trans. But as well as that, I think they think if a man wants to remove his penis, he couldn't be a man. I don't know what he is, but he's not a man because he's nothing to do with what I am, is what they're thinking. Do you follow me? That they're just like, this is beyond my
Well,
head.
I don't want to be giving you an inside secret from the Brotherhood of Men, but we kind of like our penises.
I've noticed.
Kind of important.
Yeah. Yeah. So that kind of May, June 2022, the media just ran scared officially, battened down their hatches and pulled back, you know. And I was sadly like a dope releasing my teenage book the next year. And this was a book that was pointedly about teenage problems. It was not like, there was maybe a few pages about gender, but there really wasn't. The whole book was about anorexia and all, you know, pressure and stress and anxiety and OCD and panic, all those sort of things that would be confronting teenagers. And I was really into my book. And we had, as everybody who's releasing a book understands, you have a campaign, and RTE are the kingpin. So RTE give you your first interview. And then after that, you have your interview with News Talk, and you have your interview with Sunday Indo, and you have your interview with the Irish Times or whatever. But it's very well strategically
orchestrated.
Oh my God, you don't mess around with that. And so we had that organised from December 22. And my book was coming out in April 22. And then a week before the book was due to come out, it was all organised. Suddenly RT said, no, we're cancelling. And I was like,
really?
Yeah. And I was like, well, no, you can't do that. And Gil, my publishers, were shocked and kind of said, have you done anything? And I was like, no, check me. Look, check my work. I've done nothing. And I hadn't done it. They had nothing on me. You know what I mean? I've been consistent since I've started speaking out. There's no kind of skeletons in my closet. And they then, I rang them up. I knew one of them because I'd been in the media. I knew one of them. And I rang up and said, what the hell? You can't do that. You can't just pull back. And I gave her we have a media campaign orchestrated around the fact that I'm going out on that day in RTE. And I was to be interviewed with Miriam O'Callaghan, who I have to say behaved very well. In the midst of all of the mess I'm about to tell you, she actually was very decent about it all. And but the rest of them in RTE weren't. The team around her, it was awful. And so what I said, you can't cancel me. It's inappropriate and it's scurrilous and it's despicable behaviour. And you know me and you've got nothing on me. If you were giving me a reason, I'd take it. But we all know this is just fear. And so then they had to think, because I was so forceful. I remember I was out on my walk and I was just giving it. This is a moral principle.
No better woman. You know?
And they came back and they said, okay, you can come on the show, the Miriam Callan show, but you can't talk about trans. And I said, that's fine. I'm talking with teenagers, but that's fine. Then a few days later, they came back and they said, actually, no, you can come on the interview, but you have to talk about trans. And I says, okay, right. Okay. They were clearly just freaking out, wringing their hands, you know what I mean, with a white towel around their head saying, how are we going to handle this extraordinary lunatic who's coming in? Now, they all knew me. I wasn't a wild card and I hadn't become wild. I didn't change. They changed. And then they rang back a few days later and they said, we have to record and we have one question about trans that is going to be inserted in the middle of this interview. And you have to spend, like they kind of were designated, 30 seconds on it, and then we will move on. And I said, that's perfectly fine. And in their defense, we did. But it ruined the campaign because it went out 2 weeks later. So it did ruin the entire 3 weeks later. Whatever it was, it ruined
timing is crucial.
It was. Yeah. They ruined it, and they knew they were ruining it. And they were so intensely worried. When I came into the building, it was just this feeling of like, you know... Lucifer has arrived. I was like, God, things have changed around here. But at the same time, I was very disappointed that, like, you know, Brendan O'Connor, who I'd been on his show for many times, and he had published my first article, so I'll always have a fondness for him because back in 2015, he published an article for me, and it made my book, and it really did make me. And then he published my article about trans, the one that got me the film in 2017, and he was very good when there was pushback. He could understand that I'd done a good article and we could stand over it and stuff. But he contacted Gil. His quote was on the book, which would be normal. He'd quoted another book of mine. So he had quoted I'd written, let's say, Cottonwool Quids, and he'd given a blurb for it, a quote. Mm. And they'd repurposed, Stella O'Malley's Voice of Common Sense, something like that. So they'd repurposed it for the book on teenage, And I asked Gil, I said, is that unusual? And they were like, no, we do it all the time. It's no big deal at all. You know what I mean? He's talking about the person rather than the book. And he contacted Gil and said, yeah, get my name off that. All at the same time, yeah. When Miriam O'Callaghan's team were flailing around about talk about trans, don't talk about trans, he was saying, get my name off that book.
When the hits come in, they come in heavy.
Yeah. Don't forget, there was no incident around this. All I was releasing a book on teenage mental health in Ireland. And that was it.
Speaking of which, what did you think of adolescence?
That was good. A bit of a hysterical overreaction to the thing, It was good, I thought it was sad that we didn't get to hear about the girl, and I thought it was a bit stupid that it was a boy who was a white boy, and they kind of... It felt like a socially engineered program that we were being taught how to think.
Well, it very much was so, because it emerged that the charity that Stephen Graham and stuff had been dealing with, I mean, they're involved in all of this kind of stuff.
Oh, that's depressing.
And I thought it was really good. I thought the third episode, the interview with the shrink was brilliant.
Oh, that was good. The hot chocolate and all that.
Yeah, I thought that was really, and you saw the kid turn.
Yeah. I didn't think she was a good therapist.
Really?
No, I didn't.
How would you have approached it?
I would have been a lot more, I don't know, I'm not there, but I've dealt with a lot of teenagers like that. I thought she was very timid and very appeasing And he wasn't looking for that, I think. You know, I think he was looking for depth and challenge, and she was like treating him like a wild animal, and then he turned into a wild animal. I was irritated at it was a great scene, but I was irritated just because it's my own profession. I was like, no, don't be like that with him. But you know what I loved? I loved the episode that is some actor, the dad. Is that Stephen Graham?
Yeah.
Wow, he is phenomenal.
He's brilliant.
Phenomenal, like, yeah.
But no, but what I thought was that it was a genuinely good drama.
Yeah.
The hysteria surrounding it kind of ruined it.
Yeah.
You know, and it was like, okay, yeah, it's a white kid. I mean, you know, it's statistically unlikely, blah, 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 blah. But you just take it for what it is. I mean, all you can do is judge what's on the screen. You can't judge what's not on the screen.
Yeah.
Right? So you judge what's on the screen. But it's talked about constantly in Parliament. It's been mentioned repeatedly in the Dáil. I mean, Netflix must be just rubbing their hands, you know. But one of the things I found interesting about it was that it became an excuse to beat up people like Jordan Peterson and stuff. You know, it was, the manosphere.
No.
The manosphere, you know, white men are going to kill you all. And you're kind of going,
wow.
Quite frankly, fuck off.
Yeah. It's very toxic, this kind of pitting men against women the whole time, when honestly, I really think that a lot of that has been kind of created, if you follow me, that like, I just think...
No, you don't call yourself a feminist.
No.
Which I always thought you were. I always assumed you'd be quite a strident feminist. And you're not.
Well, I'm a strident woman.
Right.
And I'm very pro women's rights, and I'm extremely pro maternity rights. I think they're a shit show, and I really think we should look at that. So don't get me wrong, I'm no trad wife, as my husband. But no, I don't think much of feminist theory. I don't agree with it. I don't think feminist theory is... I tell you one thing, I think feminist theory is anti-psychological. And so I never had an interest in feminism. It just wasn't something that was in my world. I'm very psychologically driven, and so I had no interest in it. Then I got landed into this trans alter world that it was just kind of... And suddenly feminists were everywhere, all around me. And remember I said I got very badly piled on when the film came on from the feminists because of wrong speak. Because, you know, we had an autogynephile called Debbie Hayton.
Oh, yeah.
On the show. An autogynephile is a man who is who's got a paraphilia. He's got a sexual disorder, and he's fixated on the idea of himself as a woman. And there aren't that many paraphilias out there. There's voyeurism, there's exhibitionism, there's necrophilia, pedophilia. You know, there isn't that many philias. And one of them is autogynephilia, which is, you know, man wanting to be a woman. And I think it's actually key that people who understand trans issues need to know that this is a paraphilia, because if you don't know that, there's an awful lot of men you won't understand. So I didn't know about that when I was doing the film. The premise of the film, remember, was a kind of a novice, basically somebody who's just thinking, could any of these people be like me? And I was a psychotherapist. That was not somebody who'd been in the trenches. They didn't want somebody like that. They wanted...
It wasn't tub thumping at all.
God, no. No, the idea was I was a psychotherapist who was genuinely saying what's going on. I genuinely was saying what's going on. And they, you know, the feminists thought I wasn't sufficiently using the right language for Debbie's wife, Stephanie. So, you know, Stephanie gave a very sad story about what it was like to be married to somebody who then suddenly transitions. And the children came downstairs. The children were all in their late teens, and they came down during the interview, and it was very poignant. And afterwards I said, did you never hear this before? And they said, no. They heard of the story of their dad transitioning when they were like 10, 12, 14, whatever age they were. So it was a very poignant interview. And rather than putting in the stuff that Debbie had to say about medically transitioning children is bad, instead, we chose to put in the story of Stephanie and how difficult it is to be what's called a trans widow. But for that, I got eviscerated because I asked some stupid questions. You know, when you ask, I'm sure you're doing it to me. You know, when you ask a question, but you're doing it for the audience because you know the audience are thinking it. So I asked Stephanie, are you a lesbian now? It was the worst question I've ever asked. And honestly, may I say, I didn't think she was a lesbian. I'm not stupid. Like, I was trying to say, are you having sex? Do you know what I mean? Because that was the obvious question that you'd want to know. Like, if your man transitions, do you still have a sex life? And she answered very nicely, saying, no, that part of our life is over. And that was, as far as I was concerned, job done. We got the information that every single person watching wants to know. But the feminists didn't think that. They thought, you foolish clown, because I asked the wrong question, And that gave me a bad taste, if you follow me, and I was really pretty distressed. When lockdown happened, I had time on my hands, so I just did a feminist course, saying, okay then, come on then, give me a look at it. And I did it with Jane Clare Jones. And afterwards, I thought, no, I really definitely don't agree with feminist theory. I never thought I did, but now I 100% don't agree. I don't believe it's accurate. And I have found them, in the gender critical world, for want of a better phrase, there's two tribes you come up against quite often who happen to be the kind of strange bedfellows I'm often with. One would be Christians and one would be feminists. They're the two rad femmes.
A lot of strange bedfellows.
I know.
It's really weird.
So strange.
I never thought I'd be friends with Graham Linehan, for example. But I mean, but I never thought I'd see things like Christians and feminists coming together.
So they're hanging out all the time because now they're friends around the surrogacy issue and the assisted dying. So now they're like.
And the funny thing is about the assisted dying is that I was always a big supporter of euthanasia.
Oh yeah.
Right. And because I'd seen my father die a terrible death.
Me too. Me too. And for the same reason, very complicated views. But
then I saw some of the stuff that was going on in Belgium and Holland.
And Canada.
Was a bit weird. And then Canada completely turned me. They made medical assistance in dying. If you're depressed, come in, we'll kill you. Mm-hmm. Facing problems with the mortgage, come in, we'll kill you. And there was a fantastic documentary. I can't remember the lady's name. An actress who went over and she's disabled and stuff. And she interviewed one of the doctors who administers the injections. And when I was looking at that interview, and the doctor was laughing, she was cackling, right? Do you ever get one of those weird things where every single cell in my body went, run? That woman terrified me. Far more than Pennywise the Clown in it.
Yeah.
She just terrified me. And so I've done a complete 180 on this, as I have on actually quite a few social issues. But I mean, I've gone from, and me and David Quinn actually had a row, what I thought was a fairly entertaining row, on TV about euthanasia. And I can't believe I'm admitting this on camera, but I'll only say this once, but David Quinn was right. And I was wrong. And I look at it now and, the bill that's been gone through the Dáil. Why do we think we are morally superior to every other country in the world, that we would never allow ourselves to go down the slippery slope that every other country in the world has gone down? Like, it's that sort of Irish exceptionalism that we think we have. And we don't.
Yeah.
Because we're just as bad, if not worse, than anybody else,
Well, yeah, I see it as a global movement. The surrogacy, the assisted dying, the trans, when you start really studying it and you realise, actually, this is really quite orchestrated and very well thought out. And for example, certain countries are chosen to be the pioneering countries for certain reasons. Obviously, I know more about trans than others, but the same has happened. You could apply this to assisted dying and you could apply it to surrogacy. All medical technology, all kind of, if you follow me, people with God complexes getting ahead of themselves, very clever people, seeing humans as something to kind of play with, like kind of chess pieces, if you follow me. But they chose certain countries, Ireland, self-ID, Iceland, Malta, New Zealand, to put in certain trans policies, and then they would be able to say this is international best practice. That was chosen, and it was chosen very intelligently. And the same happened with assisted dying with Belgium, and let's say in Holland, and then Canada. They knew what they were doing, and they knew what countries would accept it. And then once they've got them in, they get it beyond. So thinking of it just as an Irish issue is missing it. You've got to see it as a global issue.
What really first gave me pause for thought about the euthanasia thing was that in, I think it was Belgium, the Verbasem twins. I don't know if you know this case, where there were two lads, they were deaf and they're in their 40s. And then they were going blind together. And they were approved for euthanasia. And their family was begging the doctors, don't do this. They're just depressed. We can get them through this, we've looked after them all their lives, and the doctors went ahead. And so the family went in and to try and beg the twins to please don't do this. And the twins at the same time just put their fingers up and went, we're going up to the sky.
Oh, Jesus.
And
that's what you think?
Like, it's just, what I thought was a compassionate idea that would have made my father's death easier. I now look on as a monstrosity.
Well, there's two issues there. You've got to just separate assisted dying versus prolonged living. And I'm quite anti-prolonged living. I saw it with my own father, that like he lived way beyond what he should have. They kept on giving him new treatments when they should have said, sort out your arrangements, make your peace, make your amends, or whatever the phrase is. Yeah. They should have said that, but they don't. And I have two friends in two different walks of life. And, one woman, and she was dying with cancer, and she was told the treatment was really hurting her. It was physically hurting her. And she said, how long do I have to be on it? And they said, as long as you can endure it. And as soon as she called, I can't endure it, she was going to die. That's prolonged living. And I think we need to start dividing that from assisted dying, which I think assisted dying is actually really difficult and problematic, and I don't think it's a good road to be going down. At the same time, my dad was so beyond life by the time he died. It was inappropriate to be giving him medicine, and he didn't know he was dying, if you follow me. And it was funny. It was very sad but funny. His last night of being alive, and me and my ma were there, and my little boy was in my hands, in my arms. He was only about 3 months old, and my dad looked at me and he goes, "I'm gone," and I went, "Yes, you are. You are." Like, he was so gone. And my mum misheard him. And she goes, no, we'll be back tomorrow, don't worry.
Oh, Jesus. Anyway, listen, come here.
Yeah.
I'm going to be wrapping this up now in a minute, but this conversation's taken a very dark turn. And I think it's probably because we're both Generation X. And these conversations tend to, because we're a fairly dark generation. But you were mentioning the other day about music. What sort of tunes are you listening to?
Me?
Yeah.
God, I don't listen
The Smiths are the wedding present.
Ah, well, the Smiths.
Right.
Definitely. But no, I don't really, it's not, I don't really listen to music. I've left it all behind. I'm just listening to podcasts these days. I do think that we're in a new world where podcasts, I know I'm in a podcast now, but I think podcast is the new thing. I just think it feeds your brain. I'm just eating them up these days. So I'm listening to The Rest Is History. It's a brilliant podcast.
That's very good. Yeah.
Oh, it's brilliant.
Yeah. Well, listen, all I can say is, Stella O'Malley, I'm sorry it's not wine, it's only water.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming in. You've been an absolute illumination.
Thanks.
Thank you.